I normally have an intro planned, but I didn't have an intro planned. So I wanted to give us a moment of silence.
Here we go.
Instead. Welcome back to Avocado Inc. with your newly minted philosophy graduate.
Dun, dun,
and
dun.
Unfortunately, not yet minted philosophy graduate.
Yes. Come back in a year.
We are going to talk today about reality. So, I want to start it in this way. Okay. So, if I ask the question, what is real? I think we can learn a lot by just a simple introspection of the process that occurs in your mind, right? Upon the moment of the question, at least for me, you can tell me whether or not this, rings true for you, but I say, what is real? And I go through a process of kind of introspection, yes, but it's specifically about experience itself. So in other words, reality is something that I do not take to be an on or an off switch.
Hot take. Surprisingly hot take.
But I feel like this perceptually is true. And this is why I want to do this. You ask yourself, what's real? And I don't think that it's at all like unnatural for you to respond with something like, well, this is real and this isn't real. And I guess this is more real than that is. Mm-hmm. And that they're like, that's kind of real. Like all of those phrases make sense, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's where I'm coming from.
No, I think it's the intuitive thing to say. It's funny because most of philosophy would be like, "What are you talking about?
I know.
We can't do logic with half real things." And you're like, "Exactly." Your whole world isn't logical. Surprising.
And in all fairness, I feel like I can bring those people on board as well because I'm not trying to make some kind of deeper metaphysical claim about like how real the objective world is, or if there is one, or something along those lines. Like I'm saying that like perceived reality, that at the very least we perceive things to be on a scale of reality.
This can be like a function of your cognition more so than a function of like reality.
Exactly.
We're going for like a phenomenal experiential thing, reality, which I mean at the end of the day is what matters most, I think. But
and maybe inseparable from the metaphysical
it
endeavor.
Really could be. But either way, we'll allow like a little corner of this room to be saved for those who want it to be
exactly. So this is a fascinating concept and gives us some interesting starting grounds in I think a number of fields, and specifically just to prime you, I want to take this into the realm of time, and I want to take it into the realm of agency and will. So when I say which is more real, the fact that I have like that this is a mouse, or the movement that you are perceiving this mouse to take as I'm doing what I'm doing.
This is a computer mouse for those just listening.
Oh yeah. Thank you. I'm just like we have casually holding
mice here.
It's amazing.
In our dark philosophy lair with our pet mice. Yeah.
I think it's fair to say that the mouse as the object is perceived to be more real than the mouse moving through space. And I can make this argument in two ways. One is just the language that I just used. I said the mouse is moving through space. So in other words, the movement that is perceived in my manifold of perception, which could be its own thing. I could refer to that prior to the object, but instead I refer to it in terms of the object. I say the object moves. And thus there's kind of an implied hierarchy of reality in the language itself. And the second argument that I want to make for this is that there's an issue of consistency. So if I'm talking about something that's real, I think real, it'd be uncontroversial to say that reality has to do with persistence, that we think of persisting things as real things.
Yeah.
Maybe that's not a one-to-one, but it's at least they're very closely connected.
Yeah, a great way of testing that is just to ask if you can come up with something that doesn't persist that's real. And it's almost impossible to find one, and outside of like some paradoxical cases that are known for their paradoxical nature. So I think it's a pretty safe default.
Yeah, I would agree. And obviously there's a different kind of persistence to the movement of the mouse than there is to the mouse itself, right? Like my perception of the object as a distinct object has a greater persistence, at least expected persistence, than does that a distinct entity moving throughout space.
Now here, there's probably going to be some philosophy people that are like, okay, but you're talking about objects and movement and all of this, like there's this whole environment you're leaving out, and they would want to go like into the metaphysics and the ontology of like what does it mean to be a thing or an object. We're not going there. That's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to do like a common sense, like just analysis of how we perceive things, not trying to make claims about whether or not the mouse is distinct from the air molecules around it or something like that. Yes. So if you're on that train, please exit.
Excellent point. And that's partially because we don't really need to, make any definitive claims along those lines. It is enough for me to say that we do perceive the mouse as a distinct object, for me to then, and that we can perceive the movement of just movement in general as distinct, to be able to compare the two. I don't think that they are necessarily, like one is necessarily baked into the other, and that's as far as the argument needs to go. And if you disagree with that, then maybe there's an argument to be had. But it doesn't just have to be movement, though, and objects.
Yeah, the idea is that this is introducing a type of hierarchy that, like, just in general,
which can be applied to everything.
Which there's probably a lot of other things in this hierarchy and a lot of characteristics of this hierarchy that we don't even have words for. But like, it seems that in perception, at least, there is a type of hierarchy going on when it comes to what we consider to be real.
Yeah. Perfect. So now that we just, have the idea that there does seem to be some kind of hierarchy, I want to introduce a theory that I just would encourage you to grapple with, which I have found to be enlightening and convincing. It goes like this. So when we perceive, I'm going to use some of Kant's language because he was the one who kind of inspired me to think along these lines, because taking early modern philosophy this semester, so no surprise. So when we have the manifold of experience, that is just referencing to everything in our experience. It references everything that we feel in our bodies, everything that we feel in our mind, everything that it just appears to us in reality. And it's important because it doesn't directly reference whatever the mind is bringing to the table, nor does it particularly reference whatever it is that's outside of us.
Yeah,
that
intrinsic and extrinsic
that's
things.
Giving us something. It's referencing the in-between state specifically, the combination of both that is just the nature of our experience, right? So when we have this manifold appear, there are processes that go on. So I'm going to list a few. So as Kant would argue, we have some kind of a priori structure that allows for reason, that allows for these, what he would call the pure concepts of the understanding, negation, object, yada yada. But it doesn't have to be that specific list. I'm just trying to point out maybe a beginning of a way of looking at it, that there are some kind of a priori structures in the mind. And a priori just refers to not coming from experience. In other words, there's something from your mind itself that's actually shaping the way that this manifold of sense is appearing to you.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but this would be similar to how we would say that like having like photon receptors in your eye is kind of a priori to seeing things.
Of course, yes.
Yeah. It's like you're only going to see things. That's all you're going to get is like this image. You're not going to like physically feel the fact that you have millions of little receptors in your eyes, but we know that there's a structure that must exist prior to seeing things. This is the same type of thing, but it's a more cognizant thing. It's like there's a structure in your cognition that is allowing this to like come together into an experience.
And light is a really great example to bring up, because this is going to be really accessible. You only have 3 kinds of color receptors, or color making sense sort of things. And because of that, we see the world color-wise the way we do. But it doesn't need to be that way, right? Yeah. That's the a priori structure that's influencing our entire experience of color. Yeah. If we had a different a priori structure, one that had fewer, different kinds of receptors or more, then we would see the world the way that bees and butterflies do, or we would see the world the way that, like, blind rats do, or anyway. The point is that both are occurring. That there are things in the world that are in some way sensible and providing a way to be sensed, whether that be mediated by light or particles or whatever. In some way, they are kind of providing a way to be sensible. And then we have forms of sensing them, which we do not actually sense either of these things. We instead, our experience is the combination of these two things, whatever it is that matches up between them. So in a cognitive sense, yes, I want to talk about things like, specifically, I want to reference 3 different kinds of operator structures. Something that allows for reason, which would include things like consistency, conceptualization, this and that sort of things, identification, and then a process of memory and a process of prediction, which we've brought up before. But I think you can get an understanding of a hierarchy of reality and kind of some of the consequences of that from this structure. So when you are engaging with the manifold of experience, there's a kind of memory and prediction cycle that's occurring around them. You have an experience with something, you remember parts of that experience. As you gain more memories, you gain an ability to predict consistency through perceived consistency, and vice versa. And through this, you get in through perceived consistency, you're able to identify things, you're able to conceptualize things, and they gain reality. This is the first point, is that reality itself is the presence of something within memory, prediction, and rationality, or reason. That its very function within these things makes it real. And a way of approaching this is that if I say, this mouse, again, is real, I don't think it's uncontroversial to say that what I mean by that is that I know that it's possible to form memories about this mouse. Maybe I already have, or maybe I just know that it is close enough to other things that I have developed memories about, and so I'm able to analyze it, yada yada. And I can make predictions about this. It has definable conceptual components. It's identifiable. In this way, it is real, right?
Yes.
And the interesting thing, though, is that if we look at it from that sense, then it makes perfect sense that things would have varying degrees of reality to them. Because for some things, take air to be a great example, I don't think we take this to be a real thing for a very long time in our lives.
Yeah.
And the reason why is just obvious. You can't make memories about air. I mean, kind of. It's weird.
It's very difficult to do.
Yeah.
And usually it's you can accuse something else of being what you're remembering here. So it's like a smell or a temperature.
Or pressure or yeah.
We're actually pretty hell bent on not recognizing air as a thing.
And I think it's pretty normal for people to have like a moment in their life when they remember kind of designating air as a real thing that they didn't take it to be before. I'm interested to see if people would disagree with that, but I certainly can recognize that moment in my life.
I mean, I feel like I've had a few different moments of this in my life, but one of them was when I got my motorcycle and went on the freeway for the first time.
Oh, yeah.
Because you're just moving so quickly through the air, and like you had your image in your head of what a motorcycle on the freeway would feel like, and it is not that, because there is just an 80-mile-an-hour wind. And suddenly you're like, oh, like reality is viscous. Yes. This is why.
Yes. and your reality changed through that experience.
Suddenly it like makes so much more sense that like planes fly and stuff, because you're like, oh, this is something to be like fought.
Yes. Whereas if you're like standing on the ground watching this, like, how heavy are airplanes? Like, I don't know, 100-ton something aircraft flying.
And you're just like, what the heck?
Yeah, this is almost a ubiquitous experience. So people are just like, how does this work? What is occurring? Right?
What's holding this up?
Like, there's a perceived reality that is interacting with everything. And like, if I sit here in my bedroom and I ask myself what's real in my room, the air that in the room is probably one of the last things that's going to come to my mind when I'm talking about what's real. And so even though we've had these experiences that affirm air to be a real thing, it's not fair for me to then say that it's as perceptually real as my mouse is.
Yeah, because it's not.
It's just not. No. So there's a great example. I really like that example of affirming this idea of perceived reality being stratified and hierarchical in that stratification. So next we have to get to the more interesting part, because we could talk about lots of different objects in the world and the way that those are stratified. And I think that could be interesting, but I'm more interested in how this relates to the self. So there are structures, as we've already said, a priori structures that allow for experience to be the way that it is, partially, right? It's working in tandem with what is sensible. And the question is it possible to make memories and predictions and do reasoning on the structure itself? And I think partially the answer is yes. So here's a way of looking at it. Part of the difficulty is defining what is part of the structure and what isn't part of the structure. An excellent example for this are your limbs. So you can see your limbs. They're very much something that's easily identifiable as separate from your quote unquote self, as opposed to your eyes, where you can't see your eyes unless you're looking in a mirror. And so those are obviously perceptually different. But if I touch my hands, if I squeeze my hands together, or I really just move my hands at all, there are signals that are going in between my hands and my brain, which make the whole motion and the whole sensation, everything about it, extremely close to what you could call the a priori structure. In other words, it's all integrated in.
Mhm.
And thus, I think it makes perfect sense for us to perceive our hands, even though they are obviously objects in the world that could be classified with everything else, right? I could be holding my glass of water, and there's a tactile connection, right? There's my glass, my hand, it's all like in one string, and yet I don't perceive the glass to be part of my body. And the reason why is quite obvious, because it is not integrated into my experience making mechanism in the same way.
Another way to illustrate how integrated it is the fact that you can forget about it and still use it.
Yes.
You can't do that with anything else. But with your body, you can like just, out of habit be fiddling with something. And your brain isn't even recognizing the hand as like doing something, and just stuff is happening. But I think that's because it's so integrated with the structure that you sometimes just perceive reality from the structure and assume the structure just isn't there in order to do that.
Yeah. No, that's a great example. You walk all the time without like really perceiving your legs. You're capable of moving parts of your body and perceiving that they are moving without actually directly observing them move in any meaningful way, right?
Yeah.
So they're obviously deeply integrated with what's going on.
Another great example is the fact that when people lose a limb, they still have this structure in their head. Yeah. Their brain is like, no, it's still there. It's still a part of this structure. And you can actually manipulate that structure without it being there. You can actually trick people's brains into thinking their arm is there and that it's moving, and they do like therapy with this. And all it is us trying to like tweak the structure in your brain.
Yes. So what does it mean then? I've tried to define what we take to be a part of as parts of reality that we take to be closely integrated with the sense-making mechanisms. And I think I can define that as the parts of your body that are neurologically connected. Is that fair? Okay, everything that is neurally and neurally is I'm trying to speak more holistically. I don't mean just neurons. I mean obviously your endocrine system as well. Basically your whole body. Although I think there are technically parts of your body that are not quite integrated enough to count.
This is true. Fingernails exist.
Yeah, exactly. And that's great. That's a great example, because we don't generally think of fingernails like when you clip off your fingernails, you're not like thinking you're clipping off a part of yourself, right? Anyway, that's maybe that's more complicated, but
fascinating little aside here. Almost all of our little hypotheticals here break down if you're like under the influence of something. Seriously. Like the structures start falling apart and you actually do start thinking your fingernails are an integral part of yourself, or vice versa. You're like, my hand's not me. It's
yes. Things which affect the a priori structure are definitely going to affect your perceived reality. And that's a great example of why this, all works actually. Yeah. But it definitely is complicated. But maybe as a basic argument, we're going to say the default state is that your body is obviously perceived as a single entity, which is integral to the sense-making mechanism. Now, what that means in being integral is a couple things. One is that it is ever present to the memory, prediction, and reasoning faculties. Think about that for a second. Everything that's part of your manifold of experience can change as you move throughout your environment, right? Except what counts as everything that is closely integrated. That's the argument, is that the closely integrated things are ever present to your experience. This should be very significant because when you think about it, the more time you spend with an object, the more real it becomes because you gain more knowledge about it through more memories, more predictability, and more conceptual analysis, right? We talk about things that we know really, really well, and I think we could argue that those things that we know really, really well are really, really real to us. And thus, it makes perfect sense that something that is ever present to us, like our body and everything that's part of our sense-making mechanisms, they're just always there. And so we get memories about ourselves and predictions about ourselves just out to the wazoo. There's nothing that we know better than ourselves.
Like the back of my hand.
Yeah, exactly. In this way, there's nothing that we know better. And because of this, I want to make the argument, because I've made arguments elsewhere about how this relates to free will, but I think that this particular observation about reality says something about what the self is. Because what if we just take the self to be whatever it is, which is perceived as the most real thing in your experience?
Yes.
And I think the explanatory power of this is huge. Because one of the problems with the self is that people have long recognized that the self itself is a concept. And as a concept, it is malleable. It can drastically change. People can go through experiments where they will dissociate from their body. They will dissociate into, very specific emotions. People will go the other direction and feel like the you is everything, that the whole world is you, and that there's no separation between anything. You'll have out of body experiences that where a self is identified in a different locus than normal. And you have to be able to explain why this occurs. And I think being able to say that the self is derivative of the reality making mechanism itself gives us a lot of answers here. The first is that it would then be perfectly understandable and predictable that almost all of the time the self consists of specifically all those elements which are most integrally connected to the sense-making mechanism.
The fact that we draw a line around the body makes perfect sense now.
Perfect sense.
You're just like, oh, this is the only part that's 100%.
Yes.
There we go. Like we just
it's always there.
Cut everything else
always integrated.
100%, and here we are. Because it really is. But you can also explain why sometimes that deviates a little bit. When you're like sitting there and you like or here's a great example. If you cut your hair and it's like a big change, if you like shave it all off and you're like looking at the pile of hair that's like sitting there, I mean, you probably didn't tell other people about it, but that's a wild experience where you're like, my identity is there on the floor. Why?
We love feeling like that. Yeah, no, it's weird. It can get really weird. And
what was it Heidegger who used the example of the hammer?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's like if you use a hammer long enough, you start to just see it as an extension of your own arm. And I'm on board that plane there. That makes sense.
Yeah.
I've had that experience before.
Musicians have this experience. It's so common to say that your instrument is an extension of yourself. But the process by which these things become extensions of yourself is now accessible. We have a theory to be able to talk about it, right?
It's not just, I have this identity thing and it finds itself in random places. It's like, no, it's literally just whatever, like, ticks the boxes of reality the most. It's like what fits into this hierarchy most perfectly, and now we're here.
And in the same way, this is accessible in an empirical sense. This is a testable claim in neuroscience because those those substances, which we know to affect our sense of self and our sense of reality, can be correlated between reality and self, which I think they are. Though obviously I'm not like involved in all of the research there or anything. So that's one way in which it can be tested. And then you can also test this on if those substances affect our ability to do these specific things, make memories about things and process those memories, make predictions about things and integrate those predictions, and conceptualize and identify things, right?
Yeah.
And I think that bears out that when you take a psychedelic drug, for instance, it is in a really, really basic way creating connections where connections didn't exist before.
Yeah.
Right. And so if you just think about that on the most basic level, it makes perfect sense that that's going to mess up all three of these capacities.
Yeah.
Right. And so you expect your sense of reality to just go haywire, and your sense of self as well.
Which are perfectly correlated things in psychedelic research as far as we can tell. You don't both of those things go together.
Yeah.
Which is kind of wild. You're like, you lose your perception of reality and then in tandem lose your concept of self. That's very interesting.
Yeah. And then the other part of this that's very interesting is that it leads you into another way of accessing the ontology of will. Because if you say yourself is wrapped up in whatever is most real in your experience, then what is occurring in what is most real becomes actions of the self. In other words, self could be as simple as the change which is lumped in, which is observed, right? In direct connection to whatever is most real. So here's a way of thinking about it that I find extremely provocative. Let's say that I am hungry and I eat a hot dog because I am hungry.
There we go.
Okay. I eat a hot dog is a process in which I am perceiving within the manifold of experience is the thing, something which I take to be me, but I'm going to talk about it in other terms to try to highlight what's going on. Something is consuming a hot dog. This is an observable thing that does not need to be attributed to an I.
Yeah.
Right? We could frame the whole thing as it has been observed that a thing is hungry, and it has been observed that because the thing is hungry,
the thing is eating.
It is eating the hot dog,
yeah.
Right? And there's no. I mean, it doesn't feel freedom seems entirely arbitrary to this whole process.
Yes.
Right. It's
just an observation at this point.
It doesn't even matter, right? You're just observing that these things are happening. But that's not what's perceived, because the self, the most real part of existence, is the thing that is hungry. And it is the thing that is eating the hot dog.
Yeah.
And so that's what's happening is I am hungry and I am eating the hot dog, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a distinct flip there, which is fascinating. And that seems to bear out in maybe what you might call this first order kind of will, where you're just fulfilling passions or desires, right? It's not like you take it to be a particularly free kind of will. You're just following along with what you want, and you don't know why you want what you want. You just want it, and then you do it, right? But it's still will. You're still doing stuff. Right.
Well, and actually, I think you can illustrate this by looking at like more group identifications and how they play into this. Because if you have, let's say, you very strongly identify with a certain group of people.
Yeah.
And then things happen to that group of people that, and we're gonna, stipulate this, didn't involve you. You weren't there, like your person wasn't there. You can identify so strongly with the group that you actually have reactions and responses that are hard to explain besides saying that what happened to the group affected you. Like they did it to you, even though you weren't a part of the actual group that was affected. When your community gets hit with something, you feel like you were harmed, even if you weren't harmed yourself. And part of that has to do with that you are identifying very strong with this group. Now, this would just be saying that there is a certain set of things that are so integrated with you that regardless of who you associate with and what groups you identify with, you're just always going to identify with this, at least unless there's some other psychological problem going on. So whether or not you like it, you're going to feel like you're eating a hot dog. Like there's no real way around this. Whereas you could feel like you don't actually associate with said group of people. This you can't not associate with the consumption of the hot dog.
Yeah. Or maybe you could.
Yes, but it would.
But it would just necessitate that yourself be somewhere else.
Yes. Okay. Actually, this is a great addendum because they're actually you can document this sort of experience,
Yes.
and it's a very off-putting experience because biologically you're very connected to eating the hot dog, but you can disassociate. And in fact, people who have borderline personality disorder experience this all the time, which is just the idea that they don't identify with themselves while they are doing things, and it actually creates a ton of other inconsistencies in memory and prediction and association and all things like that.
Yeah,
fascinating.
Perfect. Yeah, the group example is also interesting because when you this is again linguistically borne out. Let's say somebody goes and hurts a member of your family, saying the phrase "you attacked us."
Yeah,
it's just a very natural phrase. It makes perfect sense. It's applicable, and yet clearly you are including yourself into an identification, in which there's no necessary connection, right?
Yeah.
Other than just the conceptual connection of there's a family, logically
Yes.
you are part of the family, and they attacked the family.
Well, and I would like to add that what's interesting is right now, if you talk to most people trying to break down this problem, they'll just they'll dump all the baggage off on this conceptual framework, and they'll just say, oh, well, the reason you said that is because you strongly identify with said group and they're a part of said group and your brain did a calculation and now you're going to identify with this harm because of this structure that you built. I would like to just forward the fact that you don't do any of that whenever you make this judgment. Like when you say you hurt us or you attacked us, like you're just saying it because it feels true. You're not like, okay, well, linguistically, this can make sense if we're using a certain framework of familial connections. It actually is you identifying with a harm. You're not doing the calculation.
Yeah. And the calculation itself isn't a necessary calculation.
Yeah.
If somebody attacks a member of the family, you could instead conceptualize it as this particular person was attacked. Why do you have to go to the family being attacked? Like what's the movement that creates that conceptual shift, right? Mm-hmm. Obviously it's the kind of identification with the greater concept. So anyway, very, very interesting. And there is this other half of freedom that I want to reference because I think it gives a fascinating answer to it. So we get the idea that we're capable of observing ourselves doing things and identifying with the doing of those things. And that makes perfect sense. We don't always think about the causes of our actions, even though we're capable of sometimes being aware of them. Like I'm capable of knowing that I was hungry and then recognizing that I ate because I was hungry, even though at the same time, when I am eating, what's proximal to me is the eating itself, not the hunger.
Yes.
And so I identify with the doing of the eating. I'm eating right now, right? Even though I still recognize that it was caused. So that's a different kind of will. The will that most people are really concerned about is this notion of like, I feel like I had options in front of me, and I feel like I could have done either option, and I did one of the options.
And that was me.
And that was me, right? So I think this gives us access to this process in a fascinating way. Okay. And it's because of this. The process by which we collapse a set of possibilities, I'm going to argue that that is always a rational process, that it's a process of our function of reason, that we're able to conceptualize that there are options, conceptualize that there are consequences and reasons for doing any of the options.
Yes.
And that and further conceptualize that in order for something to be done, one of the options must be selected.
Yes.
Or must eventually come about, right?
I'm just going to interject here. By rational process, we mean something pretty basic.
Yes.
We're not trying to reference like formalized rationality or like rational versus emotive type of behavior. This is just like there is a certain type of cognitive rationality going on where it's doing some type of calculation based off of information to come up with possibilities and cause and effect relationship. It's very basic. It's not supposed to be like, well, that wasn't the most rational thing to do. That's no.
Yeah, good point. We're talking about things like conceptualizability and identification and collapse of possibilities.
Yeah, and prediction and all that.
Yeah. So this process, though, that in which rationalization is occurring, or not rationalization, in which reasoning is occurring, is a process that we are present to. Okay, so it's observable. It's part of our sense experience that we can observe the process of reasoning occurring. What is it that makes reasoning possible, though? So again, think in the same way about how the thing that makes me eating a hot dog really possible is the fact that there is a structure which informs my eating. And a central part of that is hunger, right?
Yeah.
And the ability to eat, obviously. But in a significant way, it's the hunger that is the thing that informs and makes possible the eating or the satisfaction of the hunger. Like, they aren't really possible without each other.
Yeah.
To eat is like, it just doesn't make sense without the understanding for the need of eating. And this is going to start blowing some people's brains because they have a concept in their head that any action is fundamentally a free action, and thus, well, of course I could eat if I'm not hungry. But that's not my point. My point is not what you could do. My point is what occurs. And I think if we honestly look at our experience, we eat because we are hungry is a very just obvious thing to say. Now, if you want me to be even more technical, I'm going to say we eat because of things. Technically, it doesn't have to be hunger. I'm not trying to make an argument that the only cause of eating is hunger. I'm trying to draw an obvious parallel because it sure seems like the vast majority of the time, the reason we eat is because of hunger.
Yes, and quite explainably so. It's not a huge mystery.
And if there are alternative causes, they are still causes. That's the second part of my argument. Yes. That the argument that you eat for no reason, that is the nonsensical statement. Okay. So then we just need to turn this on to the process of reasoning that leads to this, I made a choice. What is it that's making the reasoning itself possible, right? We don't assume this to be purely an empirical process. We didn't learn how to reason just by experiencing the world. It doesn't matter how long a worm lives, the worm is never going to be able to reason. But why is that? Well, it's because they lack the a priori structures that are necessary for reason. Okay? Just as they lack the a priori structures to feel hunger. That's not something they feel, right? Whatever it is that they feel, if they feel, is fundamentally different than us because we have different a priori structures. So then, if we recognize that reason is informed a priori, why would we assume in any way that the process is fundamentally different than the process between I'm hungry and I eat? Right? We recognize that I eat for no particular reason, that it's just a choice to eat is practically nonsensical. I would argue completely nonsensical, although I know some people might try to push me on that, but we've already laid our argument out for that, so engage with it if you will. But I think it's fair to say that it's reason based. There are causes, we understand them, and we can identify them. But with reasoning itself, there is why it occurs is, and this is the linchpin of the whole argument, is that if there are a priori structures that are informing the possibility of reason, then that means that by definition, we do not have access to the cause of reason.
Yeah.
Because it's a priori.
Yeah.
So we can't ever experience it. That doesn't mean that it's not there. In fact, we recognize that it must be there for us to be able to reason, as worms cannot. But we don't experience it.
Yeah. Well, and it's exactly the same reason why you wouldn't be able to see your own eyes without a mirror.
Yes.
It's exactly the same reason, which is it is the thing that is seeing, so you can't see it. Now, mirrors give you the illusion of looking right at your own eyes, but you're technically still not.
Yeah, but even then, there is a delay, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. It's wild.
And so I think it makes, it's the most natural thing in the world for us from an experiential point of view to just attribute uncaused action to reason, to just take reason to be this incredibly real thing.
Because it's completely integrated.
Yeah, completely integrated. It's never not integrated, right? And thus, it is you who's reasoning. And then we never have access to the cause of reason because it's a priori. And thus, it's perceived to be uncaused.
Yeah.
And that's it. We reason and we take ourselves to be the sole arbiters of our reason because we cannot know otherwise.
Yeah. Which is wild. Okay, you know what this further explains that is the greatest thing ever? Okay, so if you ask someone to explain why they did something, they'll always give you an answer. It's like a really interesting psychological fact. Most of the time, they're not telling you the actual reasons.
Yeah, we're terrible at it.
It's complete fabrication. But we do it every time. And I think it just speaks to this fact that it is this structure where it's like, we know that reasoning is what was going on, like reason and rationality, what was directing us to some degree, but we can't explain the actual thing itself that's doing that. So when I ask you why you did something, you just keep using reason. You're just like, this is as far back as it goes. Is this thing that comes up with reasons? And so you just explain away. And then even if you say, okay, this is why I did that particular thing, if you are like, okay, so that was a determined cause, you're like, no, exactly. It wasn't, because there's something else going on there. It was me. There was some me there. So it's wild how.
yeah, and there's an interesting kind of viciousness to that cycle in particular, because we are capable of understanding parts of the cause of our reason, not because we have direct experiential access to it, but because we have generalized predictive access to ourselves.
We know what's reasonable.
Yeah, exactly. We observe what occurs, and there are consistencies, patterns that emerge out of reason, right? We have habits, and you can recognize how reason can affect another person, right? But it's only ever to a certain degree, which makes sense if you take the actual structure informing reason to be a priori, because that means that all of the information that you get, so all of the predictive ability that you have about people and influencing people through rationality and such, is always going to be the kind of statistical analysis that you would call viciously posterior. That you never have access to the statistics of the causal actions, right? They're just inaccessible, and so you're only ever dealing with the statistics of the consequences, right? Which is really hard to deal with.
You know what's hilarious about this is that you can just watch someone have to interact with this idea if you like start talking about psychological studies that try and set up the causes of certain things. And even if it's like the most simple thing where it's like, well, we made the participants hungry and then they ate food. Even just something very simple like that, there's this weird feeling that people get where they're like, we were predictable?
Yeah.
And they start getting angry and frustrated, where they're like, I don't like that you were able to predict me with accuracy. Because, we don't regularly have this access to what actually caused us to do things. We only have a post analysis of what happened and what could reasonably have caused that we use.
And in that way, this could challenge the earlier premise where we were talking about our ability to know the causes of why we eat. I do want to point out that I fully recognize that was a simplified analysis, because there are actually plenty of times when we think we know why we did passion-based things, because we recognize passion there, when in fact it isn't always the passion that's directly causing something to occur, right? So there are lots of parts of our experience. There are emotive parts of our experience that are a priori as well. There's basically the argument that there's so many structures in our brain, all of those a priori, and thus there's just so much about our experience that we have a hard time causally linking, right?
This is a dangerously concise model for how this all works. I don't think, listeners might not appreciate this. But the idea that you would have an explanation for our concept of self that also aligns with our psychology and how it's structured to engage with the world, that also aligns with how we reason through our environment and attribute ourselves to particular actions in like terms of free will and stuff like that, to have all of those under the same roof is very difficult. Most of the time you get one of them where you can explain, okay, here's how we conceive of the self, but it's completely incompatible with discussions of free will because we've just defined what the self is. So we have a cause for our free will. Or you have a complete conception of how the psychology works, but you can no longer understand how the self works because psychology is completely just, interfacing with a million other things. And so it's like, wait, where did the self come from? So this is like a really nice combination of everything.
Thanks, Ash.
It's great. I'm a big fan.
So yeah, that's been it's been my recent obsession, and it's a lot of fun to think about.
Well, and okay, this actually touches up on an idea that I've been working on that I was mentioned earlier, because what we're trying, and I mean, correct me if I'm misusing your theory here, but what you're pointing out is that there is a certain level of obviousness that is attached to the most real things in our experience. Yes. We can't get rid of. They're just there, 100%. So they're just assumed. And that we've associated ourselves with the most obvious thing in our experience. And then that's just kind of the rule for what ourselves are. And then we just look at instances where we are acting and we're saying that this this, in my experience, is the most real thing for me to do this thing that is rationalizing through these possibilities. And we're just like, obviously, this was me.
Mm-hmm.
Because it feels obvious 100%. It's completely caused by other things and not actually obvious. You could change the preconditions and it would change the behavior quite consistently. But because it like just fits so well with your experience, you're like, this is just 100% obvious.
Yeah. The moment that the self becomes an identifiable entity, the moment it becomes an object, it can then be the perceived obvious cause of things.
Yes.
Right? Just as other things are. That it's perfectly, like, I can perceive that when I hit a billiard ball, it is the obvious cause of the movement of another billiard ball.
And therefore it's just so real.
So that's really real. Yeah. But the simplification of the concept of the self, where in fact what we take to be a single entity, the self, is like this incredibly complex amalgamation of so many things and so much of our sense experience. We just take that and because it all feels so connected and so real, so obvious, we take it to be a single entity. And the moment that it gets simplified down to a single entity, well, then it's easy for the brain to take that concept as an entity and just describe it as the cause of things.
Yes.
Right?
So a really great, practical example, which one of my professors uses in class all the time, is you take advertisements. So why did you go get In-N-Out or McDonald's or something? It's quite psychologically provable that advertisements have a big part of that. The fact that there's a giant sign on the side of the road is actually a causal part of why you went there. But if I'm like, look, the giant, golden M in the sky is why you went and got a burger. You're going to be like, that just doesn't feel real. That doesn't feel real. That's not real. And then you're like, what does feel real? The fact that I'm here getting a burger.
Getting a burger, right? The act of getting the burger
real.
Is what
and so you're
real.
Like, obviously, this is the reason. This is the most real part of this. When you won't even remember the times you saw the advertisements. So it's not going to feel real at all for us to say that those are causally related. Yeah, it's just...
Yeah. And it doesn't help you to back up to the position of, well, it's still me doing things, but I'm capable of being influenced. Because that's just admitting that the causes which you know to be influencing you, those that have been brought to your attention as influencers, you're able to put those in a category. You're able to separate those from the self. Mm-hmm. So previously, before, the part of you that was influenced by the giant floating M in the sky was just perceived as part of the thing that caused the action to go to McDonald's, right? Mm-hmm. But the moment that becomes conceptually impossible for that to be the case, where they've just proven to you, look, it clearly statistically influences people going to eat the food, then you're like, okay, well, then I can recognize that influences the self, but I'm just going to remove that from technically being part of the self.
Yeah.
And so instead we deal with this situation where that doesn't work, because that just means that, like, you just compare those two states of affairs. Before you knew about the statistical influences of advertisement and after you knew about them, right? Before you knew about the cause, you took yourself to be the cause, but that was fallacious.
Yes.
And so we can't just be satisfied with the causes that we know. We have to question, why was it even possible in the first place to have an unknown cause affecting you and yet be attributing
You're like, it was me.
It was just to the whole process, right?
Yeah.
So that's not sufficient. You have to question the idea of, what does it mean to be perceived to be uncaused in the first place, even though you very well know that there are many unknown causes influencing you.
Well, and it's like, you're looking at this structure and you're like, well, that's kind of wild. But then it started making a lot of sense, like, that this would be the structure we would use. Because, like, how hard is it to do the calculation of all the different things that actually did cause you to do something? It's nearly impossible every single time, because there are literally things affecting you that you cannot see. Like, it just, they're invisible. But But the one thing that is quite visible, the most visible, is you. Like, you're there, and that's gonna stay that way forever. So the idea that you would be like, this is the one thing I will just default to for why things happen, is like the most practical coping mechanism you could come up with.
Exactly.
Because it's like, I can always blame it on this. It'll always be around for me to blame it on this. And what's fascinating is the more that your social structures are built up to enforce that idea, the more that it becomes like extra practical for you to associate the cause of things with you. The idea of responsibility is a clear example where it's much easier, even if it is a shortcut, to say that that this person is responsible for their behavior than to say, okay, this cloud of things that happened involving thousands of people across the continent are actually why this person did this particular thing. It's more accurate to say that.
Yeah,
like,
it is.
By all scientific accounts, it is more accurate for us to blame everyone.
Yeah.
But it's not practical.
And basically everything in your experience and huge chunks of your past and, you know, your physiological state and like, but you can just see why, from an evolutionary point of view, even, it would make no sense to conceive of things along those lines. Right?
Well, like, I mean, just really put yourself in the situation. You're sitting there, you know, on your couch watching a show, and someone comes in and tries to like murder you with a butcher knife or something. Okay, and you're the most real thing to you is the person with the butcher knife, not like their child rearing situation.
And like what brought you to sit on this couch in this moment.
Which all of them are crucial parts of the actual situation. But when you get to court, you're going to be like, the only thing that I can really say for certain is that there was a guy with a butcher knife in my apartment. Not like the fact that he had parent issues or was like under the influence of narcotics. Like, all of that just doesn't seem very real. For good reason.
Yeah. And if we've convinced you on that point, then I just want to kind of preempt the next step. We've already talked about it, but I want to make this obvious that the next step to take if you're trying to defend will is to say, okay, but what if we just like remove all the influences and go to like a really pure kind of decision? This is what Kant does.
Yeah.
Where he's like, okay, I accept all of these arguments. That makes sense to me. But what if we have reason pointed towards itself, towards the legislation of the laws of reason itself, where we can create something that is a law for no other reason than the law's sake? That's where we get our categorical imperative. And then following this categorical imperative then seems to be reason caused by reason. Does that make sense? It's completely separated from the empirical experience.
It's a perfect little loop.
It's just a little loop. And he argues then that gets you will. That's will, where where you're purely choosing between following the law or not following the law. And I want to make two observations. One is, first, if you have defined will to be simply nothing more than a priori, then I'm totally on board with you. That's not admitting that it's free in any kind of metaphysical sense, because you're not making a statement about what's causing the a priori structure. You're just saying, as long as it stays in the a priori realm, which it isn't entirely, but as close as we can or something, then like that is sufficient to will, then cool. But if you're trying to use that as an argument for defense of some kind of like actual freedom, then you've just, to be blunt, you're just taking the space which is unknowable to you, everything that is a priori to your experience, and naming that as freedom. Where I don't think we have any good reasons to argue that is somehow an uncaused thing.
Yeah.
In fact, I think we have every reason to believe it is fully determined.
Yeah. Okay, here's a good analogy that you can use. So if you own a car and you go drive to different places, and someone's like, well, look, all of the different places you're driving to are caused by something. You're like, you're actually, you need groceries, so you went to the grocery store. All of these are caused. And you're like, okay, I will admit that I went to the grocery store to get groceries. But sometimes I go drive my car just for fun. And I just go drive around without any purpose whatsoever. That is me just driving for driving.
Expression of freedom.
It's just an expression of freedom. I'm like, sure, no, totally fine, fantastic. That doesn't mean your car wasn't produced by a Toyota. Like, like there's still causes that got you there. You might be aimlessly using it for nothing, but like, it's still, someone still had to make the car, and you, and something that likes freedom, and all of those things.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's a good point. It maybe take, if we could, like, personify the car and look from the car's perspective. If the car is aware of what it's doing, and there's some kind of awareness of the reason for why it's doing things, but that's where its awareness stops. So it's not actually aware of you, the true driver of the car. It's just aware of the experience and some of the reason of, like, why it's going to a particular place.
It's like a Pixar nightmare.
Yeah. Then just take this to its full extent. So when it observes itself going to the store, it understands that this is a reasonably caused event, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a reason it's going to the store, and it goes to the store.
Yeah.
But when it's just going about doing whatever, it doesn't know why it's doing that.
Yeah. The only conclusion it could ever come to is, I'm just driving for driving's sake.
Yeah.
I'm just driving.
In fact, there is a human behind the wheel who is specifically causing all of these otherwise perceived to be random actions.
I'm just picturing a car like doing circles in the parking lot, trying to look for like the cause when the cause is just inside the car. That's gotta be like panic inducing. I wonder why people defend free will so much.
No, seriously. I feel like I've almost given a couple people aneurysms over conversations I've had with them. Because they have a real emotional attachment to free will, which is fine. I will throw out there, if you're having that kind of a reaction to this, I do not think that you need to be concerned if free will isn't real, because it does not change one iota of the nature of your experience of will. You go on feeling as free as you do because you do. Then that's all the reason you need for it.
Yeah. It doesn't matter how explained this is.
Yeah.
Again, the most real thing.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
exactly. I'm not trying to advocate for like a weird kind of psychological change.
Yeah. Like, no, you have to actually denounce all of this system that evolution has created for millions of years for good reasons.
I mean, there are some consequences, like accepting things that you don't feel like you have power over.
Yeah.
Because you should. Yeah, because you don't have power over them.
Yeah, no, this is like actually a really good point, is that there is a certain clarity that you get from being able to recognize that this is what's going on, because there are going to be situations that don't fit this picture very well, where you don't feel very real yourself, or you feel yourself identifying with something that then disappears.
Yes.
These are things that are going to be impossible for you to like analyze or make any sense of if you keep a simplistic free will type view of yourself.
Or consistent self, soul, eternal, something like that.
Now, the tried and true method of dealing with it is just like crying for a day. But that's a bit of a haphazard way of trying to make sense of your situation.
So maybe that's what we're offering you, is some non-cry days.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so this actually, I mean, I don't know how long we've been going, but this kind of brings me to this idea I brought up earlier for this episode of synthetic obviousness. So the idea is that there are certain things that are just naturally obvious. They just come from your experience and you associate with them because there's really no way for you to not do that. Like eating the hot dog. You are going to associate with eating the hot dog 9 times out of 10, if not more.
Yeah.
Maybe if you took shrooms prior, this would be difficult. But other than that, barring those circumstances, you're going to associate with it. Now, synthetic obviousness would be saying that for some reason, due to some type of situation that is specific, unique, or particular, you found yourself in a situation where there is something that feels very, very real that isn't going to naturally feel real in a different situation. So you can find this in very strong cultural groups. There are certain things that feel very, very real just because you live with a certain group of people in a certain like structure of society. For example, money.
Yes.
This is a classic example because you like chances are the last time you actually like handled real cash was a while ago because we don't use cash anymore. But cash feels very, very real. And like the idea, this abstract idea of how much money things cost is like very, very real. It feels obvious, but it's completely synthetic. There's no natural experience of money in any of the senses that you're experiencing money. It's been something that's been structured for you. And there's hundreds of things like this. Honestly, any type of socially constructed thing or like
gender is a really prescient example.
Yes. Oh, this is like the most important example right now because it feels so real.
It really does.
And I mean, both of us grew up in households that treated gender as an objectively, more than objectively, eternally real thing. And now both of us are on the other side of this issue where we've actually like interacted with people who are trans and have grappled with this idea of gender. And the more you truly try and like boil it down, the more it becomes difficult to actually associate realness with it. But the idea is it was a synthetic obviousness. You weren't even thinking of it as a possibility that it wouldn't be real until you ran into someone who considered it to not be real, you know? And this is like really well, it really explains the experience of certain groups of people really well. Because when you tell them that gender isn't real and they've lived with this synthetic obviousness their entire lives, their reaction is literally like, you have offended reality.
Yeah.
Like that is the reaction, is like, you have actually like spoken ill of the universe.
and this comes from people who otherwise, you know, you would consider to be, and they are perfectly rational, wonderful, socially upstanding.
Yeah.
Like, I could give you a whole list, and it's just bizarre the more you learn about them. And at least it seems bizarre until you realize just how powerful this perceived reality is, right? Like, Richard Dawkins is still, even at this point, vehemently on the side of defending the perceived reality of gender.
Yeah, there's so many examples like this. Another one, and this, I'm like, if you really apply this idea, so many things start making sense. Like marriage is a really good example.
Oh yeah.
This is one of the
like monogamy in particular.
yeah. The monogamy is well, actually, I would do two levels here. Marriage itself, the type of union between people, that is one of the oldest synthetic obviousnesses ever. It's been here longer than history itself. But then specifically in the United States, the nuclear family or the traditional family structure is a type of synthetic obviousness. And if you actually look at history of other places and the United States, it's not obvious.
You can see the development of that synthetic
reality. It was not obvious just, 60 years ago even, it wasn't as obvious as it is today. But it is, and we all function that way. And so when you
probably more like 80 years, but
probably this is true. I guess that was a big 20th century thing. But see what happens when you tell someone that marriage is different than they expected. It's wild. You have people who literally take a definitions argument that say your type of marriage between a man and a man, for example, that's not real marriage because the definition of marriage is between man and a woman. They're literally just saying it's obvious.
Yeah.
They're not making an argument. They're just being like, no, I am asserting marriage as the thing that is obviously this.
Which is a fine thing to say, except they're trying to make that argument as if it's making some kind of significant statement about reality.
Yeah.
When in fact, they're only making a significant statement about a synthetic reality.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah. I think I think this type of thinking about things really explains Nietzsche's God is dead phrase really well.
Oh, yeah.
Because basically everyone misinterprets his phrase, and now everyone knows that everyone's misinterpreted their phrase, but no one knows how to interpret it.
That's a good point.
But basically what I think he was saying was God was a synthetic obvious, and it's no longer obvious to people anymore, but we're still working from it. So, like, it used to be that you could just say, God said, and everyone's like, oh, well, shucks, I guess then.
God said, yeah.
But now that's no longer the order of things. It's no longer an obvious thing we can point to for people. If I say God said, there's now a whole group of people that say, did he really? Or a whole group of people who said, who cares? And so we no longer can build our society off of it, but we were still using the structures. And so that's why he was concerned. Yeah,
that makes perfect sense to me. Yeah,
wow.
I mean that you could explain basically all of this concept of heteronormativity around this as well. It's really a concise way of talking about it, but there's a kind of synthetic reality.
Well, and then also, and this is very important to add, how we've defined the self here, the I here, is just a pure association with what is real, which means that if there is something that you take to be very, very real, you're going to associate with it with yourself.
Such cool connections. Yeah. That's powerful. Wow.
That's why it feels like a personal attack for someone to challenge your ideology.
And that's actually, if we could circle that back to our earlier conversation about perceived reality, when I'm talking about the motion of the mouse being kind of a lesser reality than the mouse, it's a really good point that thinkers like Marx, when he's trying to say that everything, like the commodification of everything, is the great evil of capitalism, what he means is that there's a synthetic reality that's being imposed by capitalism wherever you view everything. I see the mouse not as an object outside of capitalism, but as a defined almost principally, maybe in some cases principally, depends on who you are and what you're dealing with, but at least it's a very high order of its reality is the fact that it's a commodity.
Yes. And its specific value.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly how much it's worth.
Yeah.
So Marx was really trying to make a more psychological claim about the danger of the reality making mechanisms of our experience and sorry, I'm going off on this tangent. I should explain myself because I've had some conversations with my brother about capitalism and socialism recently, and I've had many such conversations. But this one in particular was about the outcomes of each of these, and I found myself in a situation where I was having a harder time explaining what it was about socialism that's actually meaningful as a critique towards capitalism, because the statistics of like the economic benefits of each really do get complicated the more and more you dive into them, as I have been. And I'm realizing that the defense for capitalism on material grounds is actually far stronger than I ever took it to be in the past. And I'm just thinking about this. And anyway, this is now making me realize that I wonder if Marx himself cared at all about the economic argument.
I don't think he did.
And I'm realizing the answer is probably no, he didn't. And that I had slightly missed because his whole point about economic viability, the fact that capitalism will eventually fail, was not was not a point about the economic viability, even though that's tangentially related. It is instead talking about the reality viability.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway.
You'll see this everywhere. That's basically the closing thought for me. It's just that, like, take anything weird in the world that you're like, I don't understand why this happened the way that it did, and go find out what type of obviousness it's operating from. Because I actually take this to be a pretty big foundational concept for how we do things. You could take an acquaintance of yours that has a certain particular type of behavior that seems a little bit like out there. Like, why are they doing this? And then if you try and track down what is considered obvious to them, it'll make perfect sense. You could have people that are like literally willing to like do terrible things for their religion. And it will make perfect sense because you're like, wait a second, this is literally the most real thing to them, and therefore it is also them. That's where it comes down to, you know. It's no longer like, God told you to go, murder people. This is a really extreme example. It's literally,
It's real.
I told me to be what I am. That's what it becomes.
Or I just perceive this to be reality.
Yeah.
This is my calling in life.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Which it starts explaining just like the verbiage that's used.
Yeah.
The idea that you would want to become one with Christ.
Yeah.
It's like literally you're just like, I want to be whole.
And if we're going to keep on throwing out interesting tangents to this, this has huge consequences in apologetics.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, because suddenly the argument, I've followed resurrection arguments quite a bit, because it's the main Christian talking point in apologetics at the moment about how you can make an argument that historically speaking, the early disciples of Christ it couldn't have had any other, like, they try to defeat the other options of them being liars or honestly mistaken or something like that, and to try to leave that the only option in the end is that they had to have been honest. And if this is taken seriously, then it undermines every single argument I've ever heard against being honestly mistaken.
Yeah.
Because most people, when they try to go down this route, have to interact with concepts like, well, there have been lots of people who have been honestly mistaken. Right? From our field, what about Joseph Smith? The famous story of them dog-earing the page in the Book of Mormon right before they die. Why would they take such solace from a book if they made it up?
Yeah.
Right?
No, and there's like all this, like, why would they die for it? Like, if it's real fake, they wouldn't care that much.
And suddenly that whole argument just explodes because you're suddenly like, well, of course they died for it. Imagine being this guy who makes up this story and then proceeds to watch it have this unbelievable effect on people, right? He's actually converting people and they're following him, and he can make further prophecies and people do stuff about it. And do you see how easy,
so real,
how easy it is for that to just become real to him? Yeah. And suddenly he takes the process by which he made it up to be a process of revelation.
Yeah.
That, like, well, of course.
Yeah. Well, literally what we're doing here is we're saying, oh, you made the argument that they were sincere, thus it had to have been true. We're saying, no, they were sincere. That means nothing.
It's literally just irrelevant.
If they're sincere about it, then none of it's like trustable here. Like, chances are,
it almost makes you more worried the more sincere they are.
Which, okay, and this is wild because think about the craziest people you know. How sincere are they?
Oh, seriously?
So sincere.
Yeah.
You know how many people I know that I think would probably, like, literally be a martyr for some, like, conspiracy theory and, like, take pride in it a lot.
Yeah. And it's not because they're crazy.
No.
It's because they think it's real.
And when it becomes real, it becomes you. Yeah. It's wild.
Cool. Wow. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this journey. I have thoroughly enjoyed this episode. I wish that it could be disseminated to lots more people, but you know what? It's fun to make anyway.
We'll get.
Love you all. See you next week.